Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Bible study this morning. We are continuing our study of the book of James. We're going to be in James chapter 4, really in verse 13. I'm going to give you a chance on verse 12. I kind of dominated the end of the conversation on Wednesday night, and so I wanted to give you a chance to maybe make a comment on verse 12 if you want to. So I'll briefly do that here in a minute, but then we'll get into the remaining part of this chapter. Lord willing, maybe even complete this chapter today, move into chapter 5, and begin to wrap up our series of studies on the book of James over the next couple of Bible classes. And so with that said, I'll mention to you that I'm always open to ideas. And so if there are things that you would like to study, whether they be topical, whether they be a book that we maybe haven't looked at in quite a while, when you're in the same place for, what are we working on now? It was 2011, this is 2025, so moving towards 14 full years here, you kind of get lost, really, to be honest with you, as to some of the things you've talked about, and what may seem like I talk about all the time might have been 4 years ago that I even brought it up, and so it's just hard sometimes to know. So I welcome that from you. If there's things that you would like, again, topically or textually, that you would like to have a Bible study about, I'm always open to that, and in fact, I prefer it that way. In some ways, it makes my job easier. You just tell me what you want, and then let's go. Let's do that. And so appreciate any of the suggestions and things that you might have for me relating to the Bible class, sermon material, whatever it might be. But before we get back into our study of James chapter 4, if you would, let's bow our heads together, share in a word of prayer before we start. Our Father in heaven, thank you again for blessing us and loving us and caring for us and even allowing us to assemble today, to open the pages of your word, to appreciate the testimony of the message that comes through James. We just pray that you would give us a heart of receptiveness, that you would help us to appreciate the education and the knowledge that's provided for us, and a heart to want to make application of the things that we learn even today in our study. Strengthen us in this endeavor, guide us in your wisdom, and we pray these things through thy Son's name. Amen. Okay, so at the end of that context that we were talking about on Wednesday night, and we talked about the fact that judgment has a source, right? Who is the source of all judgment? God is. And what measuring tool does He use to exercise that judgment? His Word, right? So and we wanted to emphasize that. When it becomes about my traditions or my thoughts or my wishes or my desires or any of that kind of thing, then I become the lawgiver. And he said there's only what? There's only one lawgiver. There's only one being that sits in that position. And I have to be careful that I am not forcing others into thinking or scruples or mindsets that actually come from me rather than the lawgiver. My obligation is to honor the law. And we talked about that as it relates to the challenges they were facing, trying to leave Judaism and come into Christianity in its fullness. I believe that's the backdrop of the conversation that James is having here. That's his audience that he writes this letter to. But it is important, just generically speaking, for all of us to remember that ultimately we answer to one God. And He ultimately decides what His law is and how He wants to govern us and lead us and guide us. And that's how that segment of conversation in James chapter 4 ends. I told you I'd give you a chance. Any thoughts, leftover comments about that aspect before I move on? Because I didn't give you much of an opportunity for that Wednesday. Okay, so let's move forward then. So here's a familiar text, right? And let's think together this morning as we work through it a little bit. Well, how does this fit? How does this fit within the framework of the things that James has been teaching and saying, and not just some kind of generic, principle that he might be sharing. So he says in verse 13, "Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then vanisheth away. Now there's more thought here, and it's all connected, but let me pause at least for a minute and think initially here about what James is conveying. So he's talking to people who trust in what? In tomorrow, all right? He's talking now to people, because notice, go to now ye that say today or tomorrow. Those who believe there's plenty of time to address certain things. That's his attention, right? He's trying to impress upon them that when you're trying to improve, when you're trying to make correction, when you're trying to address certain challenges, whether they be personal or whether they be congregational or whatever they might be, there's a time element that needs to be respected. And it's easy, right, to just say, well, we'll do that. We'll do it later, right? We'll do it tomorrow. We'll do it later. And procrastination, right, happens to all of us sometimes. But it can become dangerous when there are legitimate behavioral, personal challenges that we need to be thinking about doing differently. And even the trust level that we have that those opportunities will even come. When we trust in the great tomorrow that is to come, who aren't we trusting in? The God who rules over all of those things. That's the implication James is about to make. So be careful, he said to you, who think to yourself, well, we've got these opportunities, we're going to go into this town or that town, and we've got our, we've got all of our products that we've been purposing to take to these various marketplaces, and we're going to go and we're going to barter, we're going to buy, we're going to sell, we're going to exchange, and we're going to do all these great things that are going to happen, and great gain, great benefits going to come because of that. And then in the morning, be careful, because you don't even know what. You don't know anything about tomorrow. Who's the only one that knows anything about tomorrow? The God we should be serving. The great lawgiver, right? The great lawgiver that you should be honoring, the one you should be paying attention to, the one that you'll actually stand before someday, the one who actually has the power and ability and the things necessary to determine these things. He's the one you should be focused on, right? He's the one, not the things that you're considering. For what's your life, he says, it's what? It's even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanishes away. You see that steam or that vapor rise up, and for a moment it seems voluminous, it seems large. If you've ever seen a steam locomotive function, and you see that just enormous, plume of steam that comes out, and it seems like it would never be able to go away or dissipate, and then slowly over time, ultimately it's just gone as if it was what? It's never been there to begin with. So why do you think James is trying to encourage them to remember that life is a vapor that appears for just a short period of time and then vanishes away? Why even have that conversation? Okay, so to avoid that procrastination mindset that some might adopt. Yeah. Okay, so to help them realize where their priorities should be, and reminding them of that, let me add verse 15. For that you ought to say, rather than saying we will go to that town, we will go to that market, we will go and we will buy and we will sell and we will get great gain. Right? That's the mindset he's talking about in verse 13. What you ought to be saying, verse 15, knowing that your life is a vapor that appears for a little while and vanisheth away, what you ought to be saying, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. your opportunities don't rest in your own power and control. The one who sees tomorrow, the one who is everlasting, he's the one that you ought to be focused on. And even in the simplest of things, like doing normal life business, right? That's what he's talking about. This was how they made a living. They bought and sold, and even in the mundane, just life things, we should always still consider what first? Yeah, God. What you ought to be saying is not, well, we're going to get all these things done. No, what you ought to be saying is, if the Lord will that we live, then maybe we'll be able to do this or that. But now you rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil. They had convinced themselves they didn't need the lawgiver. They had convinced themselves that everything that they desired and wanted to accomplish and fulfill was fully within their own personal grasp and abilities. And James says to them, listen, you might want to reconsider that. Because number one, you don't even know whether tomorrow is coming, right? You don't even know whether tomorrow will be. Your life is a vapor that appears for a moment and then eventually it vanishes away. Where your real focus should be is on what does the Lord will for me? What is God's desire for me? God's desire, go back, is that we do what in verse 10? Humble ourselves. And go back to the earlier conversation. God's will is that we humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord and let Him lift us up. Not let us boast and brag about how successful we were when we went down to that marketplace down in that village over there and look how successful. No, your obligation before the Lord is humility, right? Your obligation before others is to treat each other not with partiality but with respect and love. There's an obligation that we have to God. I'm just trying to remind you of the flow of thought. So don't go bragging about what you're going to accomplish tomorrow, because the fact of the matter is you don't even know whether tomorrow is going to happen. You don't even know whether tomorrow will even exist. Rather, your attention and focus ought to be on the Creator. Now, let me ask a simple question. In very simple terms, do we sometimes get caught up in tomorrow? Sure we do. Ever planned a vacation? Right? Yeah. And it's funny, right? So you set that time out here in the future where you're going to travel here or do this or do that, and you're like in a dead sprint hoping that day just comes, right? As fast as it can get here. As fast as it can get here. Then it gets here and you want to what? Pump the brakes, right? Let's slow this. I want these 3 days or whatever it is. I want them to feel like they're 100 years, right? We want to slow everything down. And then the next thing you know, you blink and it's over and you got to go back home. And all that thought process. Do we ever pause and think or realize that none of it's really in a power of our hands? None of it is in the fullness of our grasp. The world can turn on a dime. And by the way, you don't have to lose your life for the world to turn on a dime, right? You can have all kinds of plans that are out here in the future, but the circumstances and situations that come up in this world can change that. You've heard me tell you the story that moved COVID 2 weeks later in March, and my family would have been the people bringing COVID to West Virginia out of New York City. Deborah and I and Rachel were supposed to be in New York City. The 2 weeks after, they shut New York City down. Isaac was supposed to travel to China, and they shut China down to travel because of COVID. So right, and so then they tried to move that trip to Europe, and he's paid for his passport, and they're raising money, and then they couldn't go into China, so they're going to go to Prague instead. When I saw some things happening with our trip, I started thinking, well, okay, what can I do to just make some changes to that? I never thought initially that the whole thing would collapse. What's my point? My point is that's what happens to us when we get caught up in that idea that tomorrow is just going to be perfectly, if I can just get to that date. Here's what I want us to appreciate. If we'll add God into everyday thinking, right? Not just when it's convenient, not just when it feels like it makes sense, but if we include God in our everyday thinking, we are better for that. Because then He's strengthening us daily. We don't get caught up in all the future thought processes, and we don't become overwhelmed with all the great things that will happen tomorrow. And I think that even happens to us spiritually sometimes, where we're always thinking, well, I just need this extra time, and eventually I'll reach this pinnacle, and when I hit that moment in time or that moment in my life, everything's just going to be so perfect that'll be the moment that I really get engaged in my relationship with the Creator. And He's like, why are you waiting? Why are you waiting for tomorrow to make a connection to the lawgiver? Why are you waiting and putting off today? I don't really think James is overly concerned with the idea of them thinking about what they're going to take to market, when he's more concerned about the fact that they've left God out of their daily thinking. And they begin to think about only themselves and what they're going to accomplish and do. And that's the real heart of the challenge here.
Wrote about Jesus in chapter 12, what he had to say because of covetousness. But this is a parable he spake unto them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, this will I do, I will build out my barns and build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. In verse 20 it says, God said unto him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then who shall those things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.
Yeah. And that's a prime example of what happens, right? When people become consumed with their own personal things rather than thinking about the God of heaven. I'll come back, Bob.
2 Corinthians 6, verse 1 and 2 says, we then as workers together with him beseech you that also that you receive not the grace of God in vain. For he saith, I have heard thee in the time accepted, in the day of salvation have I succored thee. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation.
Yeah. Now, right? Not some, right. The focus should be, let's get this done now. Let's get our relationship with the Father what it ought to be right now. That's a great illustration as well. Go ahead, Paul.
I think a lot of this is the mindset of the individual to recognize his dependence upon God. I don't think it's so much saying those words, if the Lord wills, I'll do this. But you go to God, you're going on vacation, you go to God in prayer and ask for a safe trip.
Sure.
And to me, that's showing your dependence upon God.
Sure.
And it's not always those exact words.
Yeah.
But in some dependence, that God's in control.
And I think you're right, Bob. I think that you don't have to verbalize with every action of life with the caveat, if the Lord wills. We can do that by the way our hearts think, our motivations, even our daily requests for God's watch care over us. There are ways to express our respect and our need for the Lord in everyday life, without necessarily requiring us to add that "for if the Lord wills" to every thing. And I'll say this in relationship to that thought, because what can happen then is we can get caught up in that kind of that verbiage and those phrases. And what we end up doing sometimes, instead of making it meaningful, we just convince ourselves, well, I'm just going to do what I want, but I'm going to throw the phrase in there. If the Lord, or I'll even at times say, well, that must have been the Lord's will. Because it happened. So no, a lot of things happen in life because of my will. And it didn't have anything to do with what God wanted or desired or caused. It had to do with my will. But in order to appease my conscience, I try to just add the Lord's will must have been there because this or this happened. That it's not exactly what you're talking about, but it reminded me of that there's a caution here as well that we should respect. And let's make this a daily, meaningful relationship with the Father that recognizes I need Him always, and that I should not boast about what great things I'm going to accomplish down the road when I don't even know whether down the road's coming. And that's a great reminder. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, this is continuing a theme because this whole book is nothing more than a big attitude adjustment.
Yeah.
Because evidently, if you look at all the things that he's pointing to, then James has come across this, and it's to a wide spread of people. It's not just one people. This is something he has seen in a lot. Is these attitudes that need adjusting because they're not in alignment with the will of God. And this will make them all better people. I know it seems like a hodgepodge when you just, grasp here and grasp there, but the whole thing is that your focus, your center, your thought patterns need to be adjusted.
Well, and it's obvious when you add verse 16, but now ye rejoice in your boastings. He says you guys don't even casually consider the idea that, well, you're going to have, you brag about the things that are coming tomorrow for you without any, and so you're right, he's trying to adjust their thinking here about what they should consider going into any future endeavor. Now here's interesting, right? Verse 17, familiar, right? It's a familiar verse. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. I've heard that. I don't know if I should tell you this story or not. I'm going to. But I ran into a fellow one time. And I'm laughing because it's funny, but he told me that a preacher was a sinner. Told me which preacher it was, too, by the way. Now, I'm not going to name names. And I asked, well, have you talked to him about this? And he said, yes. And I said, well, exactly what do you believe he's done? And he said, I told him before he started preaching one night that my brother had a bad back and he couldn't sit through long sermons, and he preached long anyway. To him that knoweth to do good and to him that doeth it not, to him it was sin. That's what he accused him of. He knew it. He knew it. And he still preached long. To him it is sin. Now, if that's the way that verse worked, imagine the things that we could challenge people over. And this fella was as serious as he could be, by the way. I had a 20-minute conversation with him to try to talk him beyond that thinking. here's what we need to appreciate. When they were thinking about tomorrow, they were thinking about doing what tomorrow? Buying and selling for whose benefit? Their own benefit. Why were their prayers problematic earlier in the book? Yeah, they were asking amiss, and the reason James says they were asking amiss because you were praying to be able to consume it for yourself in your own belly, right? That's the language that's used there. All right, so keep big picture, the whole picture in your mind. You all have been so focused on self that it's made you partial in your assemblies. You've been so focused on self that you honor the rich and disregard the poor. You've been so focused on self that you have not even known how to pray in the right ways. You're so focused on self that you've ignored the one lawgiver that is God and have created your own system of traditional thinking, which we talked about Wednesday. That's exactly what Judaism had become to so many, was not even necessarily what the Old Testament law taught, but what traditional procedural things they had created as it relates to. Now, you're so focused on yourself that you brag about your potential business successes on a tomorrow that's not even guaranteed. You don't even know whether your vapor of life will still be there when that day arrives. You focused so much on self, you have forgotten God and you've forgotten others. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not when? In the time, right? Right? You know that your life is a vapor. You know your obligations before the God of heaven. You know what is being asked of you as a believer in Jesus. Sin isn't always about transgressing what the law has forbidden. Sin is also about neglecting to do good in the moment that you have to do that good. We sometimes then we get into, I don't want to call it fancy talk, but we call those sins of omission and commission, right? We talk about commission, meaning sins that where we commit a sin. We do something very specifically we're told not to do, and we do it anyway. And then there's sins of omission, where we know what we ought to be doing, but we don't. And James here wants them to understand that being a follower of Jesus isn't just about avoiding certain transgressions. It's also about doing what is right and good daily. Now, what kind of traditional mindset had they had under Judaism? Make sure every spice in the rack is tithed. Make sure you honor the hand washing. Think about all things. Don't dare grab that handful of grain when you walk through that gleaning field. Right? How dare you heal that man and not respect the Sabbath day? They were consumed with what we would define as transgressions against law. Sometimes the actual Old Testament law, sometimes their traditional conclusions of the Old. But their focus for a long stretch of time was centered almost solely on don't do anything wrong. To the point that they weren't doing anything good or right.
Jesus even condemned the Pharisees and the leadership at that time, called out exactly what you were talking about. They tied the men to human and ignored the weightier matters of the law.
Yeah.
They were focused on what not to do rather than what needed to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. And he says, go ahead and tithe of those spices, but don't forget mercy and kindness, right? Those are the things you were omitting. And that's James's audience. He's trying to get these New Testament Christians who are brand new to it, right? You know, we get the benefit of, number one, we have the full document, right? They were getting the New Testament in parts as letters would be written, as those letters would be shared among various entities. They were living the New Testament. They were getting it in part, and they were progressing and learning as they go. We have the beauty of nearly 2,000 years of having the completed message of what God intended through Jesus. We've been able to witness the historical mistakes, missteps, as well as successes in the process of time as it relates to the gospel. We get all this benefit. But they didn't. They're living the change and the transition between a mindset that had been so entrenched in them that really only focused on don't commit a sin. That they had trouble bringing their minds over to Christianity through Jesus, that was trying to get them to understand that it wasn't just about the things you committed, but it's also about the behaviors and choices and the good that you choose to do or not do. And therefore to him that knoweth, which is them now, and us since then, if you know, do it. Christianity isn't just about not making mistakes and not transgressing a system of law. We've established who has the right to give law. We've established, James says, who has right to guide and direct. And so let's get away from creating our own systems of law that we're judging each other over. And let's get our minds focused back on the one lawgiver that is God. And let's start not just avoiding the things that He's warned us against, but let's spend some energy and time doing what is good and right. And I'm going to say this, and then I'm not going to leave you any time to argue with me. But I want you to think about something. I say this. I think it's fair for us to at least consider that we as believers at times, specifically even among churches of Christ, have so centered our attentions on making sure that we never do anything wrong. We don't want to do anything wrong congregationally. We don't want to do anything wrong, right? We don't want to do anything wrong. We want to make sure our worship doesn't do anything wrong. We want to make sure our authoritative organization doesn't do anything wrong, which are needful. Notice I said that. They're needful. But the truth is, we can become just like James's audience, and we become so focused, and our attention is so centered on making sure that we never do anything wrong, that we don't do anything at all. We don't do anything. Because we're afraid. So let's define, right? Let's define where God has authorized and not authorized. Let's define what He's given to the Lord's church to do and what He's given to the individual Christians to do. Let's do all of the defining authoritative conversations that we've had for decades and decades. But then let's also focus some time and energy to say, but we can do this. And believers should be doing that. And we should be focusing some energy and time on these things. And let's not be so caught up in making sure we never do anything wrong that we never do anything right either. We just don't do anything. Best illustration I ever saw that. I've seen different ways to do it. One fellow used an eraser, set it up on the pulpit, and he said that eraser doesn't do anything wrong either, but it doesn't do anything right either. I saw a preacher use a brick one time to illustrate that. But let's find the balance, right? Let's find a balance. I saw your hand, Bob. I'll give you the last 30 seconds.
I don't know what, if you know to do good entails as far as work outside the church. You bring something to your own mind, like different things that happen in the country. That is a disaster. And do you process that, this is something I should be doing?
Yeah.
But I have work that I should be doing in the church instead of that.
Yeah.
You bring it to your mind, so you have the knowledge of something you should do,
Yeah.
but you cancel it out for something else.
Yeah.
Is this referring this to the church, or is this referring to mankind?
Well, I think he's talking to the individuals here because he's talking about the church wouldn't be going off buying and selling in the marketplace. That's his intention. I think he's talking to the individuals here at the end of James chapter 4. He's talking to each individual Christian. Well, how are you honoring God by doing good? But we all have limitations, right? And we all have to make judgments about the decisions we make as it relates to how we go about doing good.
Well, the means would have to be present.
Right.
To be able to help someone.
Yeah. That's a good question. We'll summarize chapter 4 and we'll come back to that Wednesday. And let's talk about that because that's a good question. I think it's fair for us to discuss that for a little bit. So Wednesday night when we come back, I'll come back to James 4. We'll come back to that question in particular as we wrap it up. Then we'll move to chapter 5, Lord willing, on Wednesday. Because that's an important question. Because, right, we know to do good, but how do you balance it? You know, how, do I have to do everything that I've ever noticed that could be good for me to do? And how do I strike a balance with those things? And I think that's a fair question. We'll come back to, Lord willing, on Wednesday.